William didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He didn't even look at Camilla when he slid the cream-colored folder across the room and said 4 words that changed the temperature instantly. Freeze every authorization, now. Nobody moved. Not the private secretary standing near the window, not the legal advisor with his pen suspended over a yellow pad, not even Charles, who had been staring at the folder as though he already knew something inside it was about to become impossible to ignore. But Camilla moved. Just slightly. Her eyes dropped to the bottom right corner of page 7. That tiny reaction was all William needed, because the signature sitting there wasn't his. It wasn't Charles's, it was hers. But the signature wasn't the part that made William order an immediate review. What sat 3 paragraphs above it was worse, much worse. And by the time Charles finally understood what the arrangement could mean, the question inside that room was no longer, who approved this? It was, how long has this been happening? To understand why William reacted so quickly, you have to go backward. Not very far, just 48 hours. Because 2 days earlier, there was no confrontation, no emergency review, no folder on the table. There was just one strange name appearing where William's staff didn't expect to see it. When the fighting ended, millions were dead. A routine internal briefing had landed on the Prince of Wales's desk concerning access, staffing, charitable appearances, private residence usage, and several overlapping family arrangements. Boring stuff. The kind of paperwork people skim. Except William didn't skim one page. He stopped, then went backward, then read the same line again. A name connected to Camilla's wider family circle had apparently been added to an internal consultation list. That alone wasn't explosive. But William noticed the date. The authorization had been entered months earlier, before the meeting that was supposedly meant to approve it. Wait, what? That was the first problem. The second came when William asked who had requested the change. Nobody gave him a straight answer. One office said it had come through another household. That household said it had merely implemented an existing understanding. An existing understanding? William reportedly wanted one thing at that point: the original paperwork, not a summary, not somebody's recollection, not a polite explanation, the paper. That request should have ended the mystery. Instead, it opened another one. Because there wasn't one document, there were 6. 6 separate authorizations, amendments, notes, and private memoranda that appeared harmless individually. Put them together? Different picture entirely. One concerned guest access, another concerned use of staff, another discussed representation at selected private engagements. Then came a clause involving property consultation. That was the one that made the room go quiet, because consultation sounds innocent, until you ask one question: consultation by whom? William did, and the answer led directly back to Camilla. But even that wasn't the secret arrangement. Not yet. Because what William's advisors had uncovered wasn't one dramatic signed contract sitting inside a safe. That would have been too obvious. This was smarter. Small permissions. Separate offices. Different dates. Nothing shocking enough on its own to trigger alarm. But collectively, they created something that looked very different from what each individual page suggested. Influence. Slowly accumulated, quietly distributed, almost invisible unless someone placed every document beside the others, which is exactly what William did. Picture that moment. Late afternoon. Rain against the windows. 6 papers spread across a long desk. William standing instead of sitting. One advisor reading dates aloud. February, April, June, September. Then another date stopped everything, because one authorization appeared to reference a conversation with Charles that nobody could find in the official diary. Now William had a different question. Did the conversation happen privately? Or had someone invoked the king's name to push something through? That distinction mattered. A lot. William asked Charles directly. Charles remembered discussing family practicalities, nothing more specific. Then William showed him the wording. Charles stared at it. Read it once, then again, and suddenly the problem changed shape, because Charles had apparently approved a broad principle. But the language later used inside the internal paperwork went much further. That was the gap. And someone had used it. The arrangement had started, at least in this fictional scenario, with a simple concern: continuity. Camilla wanted certain people she trusted to remain connected to parts of royal life that might otherwise disappear after a future transition. Not titles, not crowns, nothing that obvious. Access, relationships, invitations, influence over small domestic decisions, the sort of things nobody outside palace walls would ever notice. Except there was a catch. Once written down, those privileges could survive people. That's when William's attitude hardened, because he wasn't looking at a favor anymore. He was looking at precedent, and precedent inside a monarchy can become more powerful than intention. Here's where it gets stranger. Camilla apparently didn't see the arrangement as hostile to William at all. In fact, when confronted, she made the opposite argument. She believed the provisions created stability. William believed they created a parallel structure. Two interpretations. Same documents. Only one of them could survive the review, and Charles was trapped directly between them. But the real shock hadn't landed yet, because page 7 contained a provision nobody had mentioned in the first briefing: a review clause. A tiny paragraph, easy to miss. It stated that certain permissions could be reconsidered upon a major change in royal responsibilities. Read that carefully. A major change in royal responsibilities. William saw the opening immediately. If the arrangement could be reconsidered, then it could be suspended. That's why the emergency meeting happened. Not because William had already proven wrongdoing, because the documents themselves gave him a mechanism to stop everything while he determined exactly how far the arrangement reached. And that's where we return to the cream folder. William sliding it forward. Camilla looking at page 7. Charles saying nothing. Freeze every authorization, now. The order didn't strip anyone of a title. It didn't throw anybody out of a palace. It did something more dangerous. It stopped the machinery. Every disputed permission would be reviewed. Every linked memorandum traced backward. Every reference to royal approval checked against diaries, correspondence, minutes, and private office records. Suddenly, the arrangement that survived, because nobody had viewed the pieces together, was about to be examined as one complete structure. And Camilla knew exactly what that meant, because the first thing investigators would discover wasn't necessarily who benefited. They would discover who built it. Would you have spotted this from 6 harmless-looking pages? Because William almost didn't. And if you enjoy palace stories where the smallest detail turns out to be the one everybody should have noticed, subscribe, because what happened next made that signature on page 7 look almost ordinary. The review team found a 7th document. Nobody had included it in the folder. That was the problem. William's office learned about it only because one of the 6 papers contained a handwritten reference in the margin. 3 words. See private schedule. Private schedule? There wasn't one attached. William asked for it. Silence. Then a staff member remembered seeing something with that title months earlier. Now the palace wasn't searching for an explanation. It was searching for a missing document. And when the schedule finally surfaced, the entire arrangement changed again. Because the document contained names. Not just Camilla's. Not just family contacts. Royal names. Senior ones. Including Prince Edward. That made no sense. Edward wasn't supposed to be part of this. Until William read the note beside his name. Future stewardship consultation. There it was again. That slippery word. Consultation. But consultation over what? The next line was partially redacted in the copy initially handed over. That didn't go down well. William wanted the unredacted original. The legal advisor requested it. Another office hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than an hour. But inside a palace under scrutiny, an hour can feel like a confession. The full version arrived. William opened it. Charles was called back into the room, and Camilla's position became considerably harder to defend. Because the clause wasn't about giving Edward something. It was about what would happen if Edward didn't accept something. Stay with me. The arrangement anticipated resistance. Someone had actually thought ahead and written instructions for the possibility that a senior royal refused to participate in the proposed structure. Why would anybody need that clause unless they expected pushback? That was William's question. Camilla's response was simple. Because families disagree. Fair answer. Until William pointed to the date. The refusal clause had been drafted before Edward had even been formally consulted. Someone had predicted his objection before asking him, "Wait, how?" Now Edward had to be brought into the review. He arrived expecting a short conversation. Instead, he was shown the schedule. His expression reportedly changed before he reached the second page, because Edward recognized something William didn't. A reference code. One tied to a private discussion years earlier about preserving responsibilities originally associated with Elizabeth's generation of the family. Edward remembered the conversation, but not like this. In his memory, it had been sentimental, almost casual. A discussion about protecting continuity, family duty, and certain traditions after the late Queen was gone. But somebody had turned that conversation into administrative language. Then that language had been linked to Camilla's arrangement. That's the moment the review stopped being about Camilla alone. Because now there was another possibility. What if she hadn't created the entire structure? What if she had stepped into something that already existed? Charles leaned forward. William went back through the dates. And there it was. The earliest memorandum predated several of Camilla's later approvals. The architecture had already begun. That changed everything. For 10 minutes, Camilla had looked like the person at the center of the maze. Now she looked like one of the people who had entered it. So who built the first corridor? William ordered the team to trace the original memorandum. They found the author, a retired private office advisor. But that didn't solve the mystery. It made it worse. Because the advisor's note included one sentence, prepared following family request. Whose request? No name, no initials, nothing. Charles thought he knew. Camilla thought she knew. Edward had another idea completely. William trusted none of them. That's when he did something nobody expected. He widened the review. Not just Camilla's authorizations. Everything connected to the original request. Years of correspondence, old meeting notes, private schedules, property discussions, staffing agreements, every document touching the same chain. Camilla objected, not angrily, quietly. She warned that widening the review could drag unrelated family matters into something they were never intended for. William's answer? That's exactly what I'm worried about. That line landed hard, because suddenly, the threat wasn't what William might discover about Camilla. It was what he might discover about everyone, including Charles. And Charles understood the implication. His own past approvals were now inside the review. There was no clean side of the table anymore. Then came the first real crack between father and son. Charles wanted the review contained. William wanted it complete. Charles argued that private family understandings couldn't be treated like hostile evidence every time responsibility shifted. William pointed back to the documents. Private understandings were exactly how the problem had started. Neither man backed down. Camilla watched them fight over a structure bearing her signature, but another signature was about to appear. The review team discovered a short covering letter attached to the earliest memorandum. One page, no dramatic language, No instructions, just confirmation that the arrangement had been received and noted. At the bottom, Charles's initials. The room froze. Camilla looked at William. William looked at Charles. Charles looked furious. Not because the initials were fake, because they were real. He remembered the note now. He just hadn't understood what those earlier papers would eventually become. That sounds like it clears Camilla, doesn't it? Not quite, because her later signature expanded the original arrangement. Charles may have acknowledged the seed, but Camilla's paperwork helped grow the tree. And William was now standing underneath it with an axe. The question became painfully simple. Did Charles's early acknowledgement legitimize everything that followed, or had the original intention been stretched beyond recognition? The lawyers wouldn't answer immediately, which meant William's freeze remained. No permissions restored, no disputed access reinstated, no quiet return to normal. Then Edward asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. What happens to the assets mentioned in the schedule? Silence. William turned pages. Camilla looked toward Charles. That reaction was enough. There were assets, not personal inheritances in the conventional sense. Stewardship interests, use arrangements, legacy possessions, objects and spaces whose value came less from money than from what they represented. One entry was tied directly to a future role Edward had never been told he was being considered for. Now he was angry. Not because something had been taken from him, because someone had planned around his future without telling him. That's a different kind of betrayal. Edward pushed the folder away. He didn't want the role. At least not under those conditions. But his refusal created another problem. Remember that clause written before anybody asked him? For the one anticipating resistance? It automatically redirected consultation elsewhere. To whom? That name was on the next page. And when William saw it, he finally understood why Camilla's family connections had appeared in his original briefing. They weren't the starting point. They were the backup plan. There it was. The secret arrangement wasn't simply designed to place Camilla's people inside royal life. It was designed to keep a specific network functioning, even if one of the senior royals refused to participate. Edward's refusal wouldn't kill the system. It would activate the substitute route. Suddenly, every small permission made sense. Guest lists, staff access, private consultations, residence usage, separate pieces. One mechanism. William closed the folder. That should have been the final reveal. It wasn't. Because Camilla then said something nobody in the room expected. I told him not to include that. Him? William turned. Charles did too. Who was him? The retired advisor? No. Camilla shook her head. The request had apparently passed through another intermediary. Someone who had been involved in translating informal family wishes into written administrative proposals. William asked for the name. Camilla hesitated. That hesitation was brief, but fatal. Because Charles suddenly knew who she meant. His face changed. The intermediary had worked closely with multiple households. Someone trusted precisely because he never seemed attached to one faction. And he had left royal service years earlier. William immediately ordered every paper connected to that advisor pulled into the review. Now, the arrangement wasn't 6 documents, or 7. It was dozens, different years, different households, different purposes. The supposed Camilla scandal had exploded into a structural problem inside the family's private decision-making. But William still wasn't finished. He wanted to know one thing. Who benefited if nobody ever noticed? The answer turned out to be uncomfortable. Almost everybody. Charles got continuity without confrontation. Camilla got protection for people she trusted. Advisors got predictable procedures. Edward could theoretically inherit responsibilities without public family argument. The household avoided messy decisions. Everyone gained something. which meant nobody had much incentive to pull the structure apart. Until William did. That was the real threat. Not that he had caught one person plotting behind closed doors. That would have been simpler. William had discovered a system built from years of compromises. Some approved, some assumed, some expanded, some barely remembered. And now he had ordered every part of it exposed to daylight. The final review meeting lasted well into the evening. Charles looked exhausted. Edward barely spoke. Camilla kept one hand resting on the closed folder in front of her. William stood near the fireplace, while the senior legal advisor explained the options. Restore everything. Impossible. Cancel everything. Potentially disastrous. Review each authorization separately. Slow, painful, but clean. William chose the third option. Every arrangement would have to justify itself from the beginning. No inherited assumptions. No, that's how it's always been done. No approval surviving merely because nobody wanted to reopen an old argument. One by one, name by name, document by document. Camilla finally asked the question hanging over the room. And if they don't survive? William looked straight at her. Then they were never strong enough to exist. Nobody answered. But Charles did something unexpected. He reached for the first memorandum, the one carrying his own initials. For several seconds he stared at them. Then he drew a line through the page, not tearing it, not destroying it, just marking it. As if he were finally separating the decision he remembered making from the consequences that had grown around it. Camilla watched him. Edward watched William. Nobody had won. That was the strange part. Camilla hadn't been thrown out. William hadn't seized some dramatic treasure. Charles hadn't lost his crown. Edward hadn't suddenly inherited a palace. But something much harder to rebuild had disappeared. Trust in the old shortcuts. And William's immediate review meant every future conversation would now carry a question nobody inside that family could easily silence. Who actually authorized this? The meeting ended after dark. Staff gathered the papers. Folders were numbered, copies sealed. One by one, the chairs emptied. But William stayed. On the desk sat the original page 7, Camilla's signature at the bottom, the review clause above it, and beside those words sat the handwritten instruction William had added after the meeting. 3 lines. No drama, no accusation, just a rule. Nothing carries forward merely because it was hidden in what came before. And somewhere else inside the palace, another unopened file still carried the same reference code. If that file contains what William's team now suspects, this review may not have exposed the arrangement at all. It may have exposed only the first layer. So tell me this in the comments. If you were William, would you stop after reviewing Camilla's arrangement or open every file? Because once you start pulling at a thread like this, you don't get to decide what comes loose next.